you might describe it as a particularization of the kingdom of God. That's one way of thinking about it. And I think that's fair when talking about Piaget, because Piaget, what motivated him throughout his entire life, and people don't know this about Piaget generally speaking, was the reconciliation of science and religion. That's what drove him. So,
and most people, just for the audience that may not recognize his name, so most people, I'm making an assumption here, recognize him as largely a child and developmental psychologist.
Yes, right? Which is not how he conceptualized himself. He thought that he was it's something like developmental epistemologist.
And can you refresh my mind and perhaps those of the viewers as to what that equilibrated state meant in Piaget's knowledge structure and how that relates to what we were discussing?
Sure. Peekaboo with an infant, right? And so the infant can play peekaboo. And what happens when you play peekaboo with an infant is that very rapidly, by gesturing, you and the infant settle on the rules of the game. And what you want to do is engage the infant, right, in play, because you find that intrinsically rewarding. And so the infant will look at you, and then if you smile, he'll smile, generally speaking. You can tell if the infant's in a playful mood, and then you can hide your face and look. And you calibrate that so you don't startle the infant. You want to surprise the infant. You want to put the infant on the border of order and chaos, because that's where the fun is. And so you play with hiding and re-manifesting yourself, and it produces delight in the infant. And so what you've done there is spontaneously organized a tiny societal microcosm. And so, and that's the sort of thing that Piaget was particularly interested in. He was interested in how children formulate games. And the games are tiny societies. Everyone agrees on the rules and they play them out. They're microcosms of society. And as the children transform, the confines of the game expand until the game and the social world are indistinguishable. It's like the life of a pro football player. Is that real life or is that a game? Well, at some point, the game is life. Right. And so then the question is, well, what should the game be? And Piaget's answer was, well, the game should be one that everyone agrees to play. And so then that's one that, and there's more to it than that. And some of this is, I suspect, some of my further development perhaps of Piaget's ideas is that there's a bunch of rules of the game. And this is why the postmodernists, by the way, are wrong about the infinity of interpretations. They're wrong. There is an infinity of potential interpretations, but there isn't an infinity of viable interpretations. And that's the issue. That's the critical issue. So what constrains the range of interpretations? Well, let's say there's an infinite number of ways of construing the world. Well, there are. And that's again, the postmodernist take, right? It's not only can you interpret texts an infinite number of ways, but the world is a text, and it can be interpreted in a number of ways. And so you can't define any particular mode of interpretation as canonical. That's the fundamental claim. Okay, let's take that apart. Wrong. First of all, my interpretations have to keep me going. And they also shouldn't result in an excess of agony. Because those are games I'm not going to play. So if I extract out an interpretation, like a hot stove is something upon which I can rest my hand, my agony will tell me that that's a non-viable solution. And it isn't just agony. It's the whole panoply of things that produce suffering. Hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, the necessity of elimination, sexual desire, all these built-in biological modules that are part and parcel of our evolutionary history, which the postmodernists are forced to deny, partly because it undermines their theory and partly because it interferes with their sociocultural determinism and their Marxism. But the biological evidence is quite clear. This is why our concordance with animals is so tight that you can use antidepressants on lobsters. And we diverged from lobsters about 300 million years ago. There's conservation like you wouldn't believe. And so we're made up of biological modules, and they have their own worldview. The hunger system has a worldview. The pain system has a worldview. And the pain system, that's a dominating system. You mess with that thing, it'll flatten you.
Is there not a tension here that, I mean, I'm with you completely on this. I follow you because this is sort of my bread and butter as an academic. I hope the audience is able to keep up as well, because it's incredibly important, I think. But is there a tension in your mind between what you're describing, the fact that we're nested in a biological reality that inherently constrains our viable options for interpretation? Mm-hmm. Is there a tension between that and the notion of optimizing for being as opposed to material reality? Because I think when some people hear you talking about the realm of being versus the realm of the material, they assume or conflate the realm of being with what you're describing the postmodernists to indulge in the sense of, well, anything is open. You're in the realm of imagination. You're in...
Oh no, being is radically constrained. Radically. Okay. Well, let me outline the other constraints.
And if I understand correctly, this is precisely the difference between your position, your version of pragmatism, and the postmodernist position, about which there's been significant confusion.
Well, that's because because Harris had me talk about the person from whom he...
Rorty.
It isn't Rorty. Wasn't part of my pragmatism. I made that clear. It's right. The William James and C.S. Peirce version.
But there's a conflation, I think, in some people's minds. So this, what you're describing, is precisely you're differentiating.
Differentiating. Precisely. Okay, so we'll say first we're subject to biological constraints. Okay, we're subject to biological constraints, and then we're subject to temporal biological constraints, which is that not only are we hungry today, but we're going to be hungry tomorrow, and we're going to be hungry in a year. So the biological constraints are now and later. Okay, so the solution has to solve both those sets of problems, but that's only the beginning, because I have those problems, but I also have the problem that there you are, and you have those problems. And so then we either fight, which is a problem, or we mutually negotiate such that we generate a solution, such that you get to solve your problems at the same time I get to solve my problems, or maybe we even do it better. You get to solve your problems in a manner that helps me solve my problems, and I do the same for you. Okay, that's not easy. That's narrow, and you know that because if you live with someone, you're constantly arguing with them. And the argument is, which interpretation will suffice? Right, and so no, there's not an infinite number of interpretations. There's hardly any. Okay, so, but then it isn't just me and the person I live with. It's me and the person I live with, and the family and the community, and the community and the polity, and the economic system and the biological system. All of that has to be stacked up, one on top of the other. So the game is played at every level, simultaneously, the same way. And that's, in my estimation, that's what a symphony expresses, right? That's what it's telling you. It's stacked the level of being so that every level operates harmoniously with every other level. And then I would also say that because we're evolved for that, we can tell when it's happening, and that's what the sense of meaning is. The sense of meaning is it's our third eye, you could say. Your eyes blind you because they only see what's here right in front of you now. They blind you, and so you have to use modes of perception that transcend mere vision in order to conceptualize being properly. And one of those modes is the sense of meaning and engagement. And that involves extraordinarily ancient systems. So, for example, it's produced in part by the dopaminergic systems, and they're rooted in the hypothalamus, which is an extraordinarily old part of the brain, and a very, very, maybe the most fundamental part of the brain. It's the one where most of the biological subsystems have their rootings, the hunger systems and the lust systems and that sort of thing. And so the sense of meaning is extremely old. But it's differentiated very finely in human beings. And when you're engaged meaningfully, then what that is, it's an intimation that the levels of being are lining up at least to some degree. And you'll feel that. You can feel it as a sense that life, what it is a sense that life is meaningful. And that sense is the thing that enables you to overcome tragedy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but there can be a tension between what is meaningful for a given individual and what is meaningful on a societal level or for the most number of individuals, right? I'm thinking of, let's say you have a despot. What's meaningful for the despot is when, he feels like he's in complete control of his country. And then he experiences that subjective state of meaning that you're describing as ancient and important.
But I don't think that is what he experiences. I think he's driven substantially by terror and malevolence, and that's not the same thing. It's not like those things aren't motivating. I'm not saying that this sense of transcendent meaning is the only motivator. Clearly it's not. There's sub-motivational systems that can take control at any time. But I don't believe that the the sense of meaning that I'm describing is akin to what a tyrant feels when he's tyrannizing. That's more like jealous rage or something like that, or resentment. But now, I would say that there's an exception to that. So, because one of the things we haven't talked about is the necessity for truth. So let's allow for a moment that the faculty that produces this sense of engagement has the qualities that I attributed to it, but I would say that also only works properly under certain conditions, which is if you are sick, physically, biologically, neurologically, then it's certainly possible that meaning system is going to go astray, and it's going to signify meaning where the alignment isn't proper. Well, that could happen for any number of reasons. It seems to happen in schizophrenia, for example, at a very, very low level. But I would also say you risk making that happen to you, which means you can no longer trust your deepest instinct, by lying to yourself. Because what you do, so that could be selective omission of information. That's the most common form of lie. It's passive avoidance, willful blindness. That's the most common form of deception. Although active deceit can also play a role. If you contaminate the structure of your being with false information, with deceptive practices, and you willfully blind yourself, then you're going to be led astray by your sense of meaning. You're going to pathologize it. So part of the issue here is that you don't want to interfere with your ability to see, because you'll wander off the road into a ditch. And so, people think, well, why should I tell the truth? Which is a great question, man. Every smart kid figures that out. Like, the smarter the kid, the younger they figure that out. It's like, well, if I can lie to get what I want, why shouldn't I, given that I want to get what I want? And that's a great question.
Okay, so here's a follow-up then. Why not engage in a series of white lies?
First of all, sometimes that's the best you can do. Like, you could say that, well, you're morally impelled to come up with the best solution you can under the circumstances. And what you want is a statement that validates, that serves all levels of being simultaneously. But sometimes you don't know how to do that. And that's when when someone, the example that springs to mind for me always is the classic kind of joke situation where a wife asks her husband, does this dress make me look fat? Or what do you think of this dress? And maybe the answer is, I hate that goddamn dress. And maybe that's the answer. But maybe the answer is, if the question is, do I look fat in this dress? The answer is, I don't answer questions like that. Right? So that would be the truth in that situation. Or there would be the white lie, which is, oh, you look beautiful. But I don't believe white lies are suboptimal solutions to a complex problem. So that's all, because they're true at some levels of analysis and they're false at others.
Are there cases where stating what appears to be the truth to the best of your ability to articulate it is inferior to a pragmatically functional white lie?
I would say it depends on your motivations, because I can use the truth to hurt you. But then I would say that then what I'm doing is like a white lie. It's like a black truth, let's call it that. It means that it also doesn't serve the ordered structure entirely, because it's true on 3 levels of analysis, usually sub-levels, and not true on a really profound level. So I can say, well, I'm just telling you this for your own good, and I tell you something true, but I picked a context in which or a state of vulnerability that I know you're in which delivery of that message has an undermining effect. And I know that. So I could say, well, it was true. It's like, well, no. All things considered, it wasn't true. Some things considered, it was true. And a white lie is the inverse of that. It's like, well, on some levels, it's true. It would be wrong of me to hurt your feelings over such a trivial issue. And so in order not to violate that higher moral principle, I'm going to violate a subordinate moral principle.
Right. And in your system of thought, that higher moral principle, that higher level, is still part and parcel. In fact, it's perhaps the pinnacle of the notion of truth. Whereas for someone, again, just to make reference to a previous interview you had with Sam Harris, the conflation or the intentional combination of moral truth with factual truth is either bizarre or just it doesn't occur to people.
Right, but he wants to do that anyways. He just wants to do it in reverse.
Right.
Because I was making the case that by necessity, factual truth is subordinate to moral truth. And he was saying, no, moral truth can be derived from factual truth. It's like he doesn't get out of the problem. The problem is the necessary coexistence of both forms of truth. He just inverts the causal order.
Right.
Now, the problem with Sam's account is that, and this is the problem that Immanuel Kant identified so many years ago, is like, do the facts speak for themselves? Well, no, they don't, because facts say a number of different things. Like if there's a field in front of you, it does not tell you which path to take through it. Right, but it's worse than that. It's worse than that because there's an unlimited number of facts. And the problem is, how do you select them? And the answer to that is, the facts themselves cannot tell you that. And that's why you have an a priori interpretive structure, which is, of course, what Kant was insisting upon. And Sam doesn't take that into account, and that's mind-boggling to me because that a priori interpretive structure is the sum total of the effect of our evolutionary history. So, like, what about that? Where does that play into the game? We're so selective in our attention. It's unbelievable. There's been estimates that the bandwidth of our conscious attention is like 4 bits. We're pinpointing the world. Well, some of that's conscious because we can make decisions about what we look at, and a lot of it's unconscious because our attention is directed by these fundamental underlying biological subsystems. But we're making intrinsic value judgments all the time that are not derived from the facts at hand. That's a blank slate viewpoint. Now, and how Harris can't be a blank slate believer if he's an evolutionary biologist. And the same goes for Dawkins.
What you just said made me think of, I think in our previous interview, you had mentioned motivated action and motivated speech. And I think for people who are not necessarily familiar with or are more than happy to readily dismiss psychoanalytic approaches, that doesn't make much sense. It's sort of, it's a boogeyman, an intellectual boogeyman in a sense. But I think, if I understand correctly, when you reference motivated processes, you're describing something similar to what you just described in the sense that we have a whole series of sort of undeniable biological impulses that constrain our cognition, that constrain what we pay attention to and what motivates us. And even when we think at a conscious level that we're doing something for one reason, we're very good at creating rational explanations for behavior that we're actually engaging in for much deeper impulsive reasons.
Well, that's part of the fact that we're not transparent to ourselves. Like people like Gazzaniga have made the claim, and I think Dennett has really been hitting this hard lately, that mostly what our conscious mind does is come up with post hoc rationalizations for our behaviors. And it's like, well, just because something is partly true some of the time does not mean that it's absolutely true all of the time. We are trying to understand ourselves continually, and sometimes we come up with partial accounts for why we did what we did. But consciousness is also the builder of our habits. Now, it's not the only builder, but you consciously attend to some action in a new domain and practice it. The consciousness builds up those habitual structures, and then they run automatically. But that doesn't mean that consciousness was irrelevant to their production. It was very relevant to their production. It's not just a mere post hoc add-on. It's not that at all. Consciousness is what you're playing a sonata, and you make a mistake, and you play it again, you make the same mistake. And so what do? Because you're playing it automatically. You've built the habit with hours and hours of practice and conscious attention. You've rewired yourself, building automatic mechanisms. An automatic mechanism fails. So what do? You look more intently at the notes, then you slow down, and you restructure the habit, and then you speed up, you speed up, you speed up, then you play the segment, then you play the segment again, then maybe you go back to the beginning and zip through, and then you've restructured that automatic system. Consciousness did that. It's not just a post hoc rationalizer, although it can be that. And it's often not a rationalization either. Sometimes it's an investigation into the actual causal structure. It's like, well, I did that. Why'd I do it? Well, sometimes I want to come up with a story that sounds good to other people, let's say, which seems to be, Gazzaniga's theory about why we consciously utter post hoc rationalizations to justify our behaviors to ourselves. It's, Jesus, that's pretty cynical. No, often it's a deep attempt to identify the likely causal contributors. And in part, look, you could say, well, we just don't have that capacity. It's like, yes, we do, because otherwise we would continually repeat the same mistakes. The fact that we can learn from, if we learn from our experience, what we do is reconstrue our maps of value so that we don't replicate the error in the future. And because we are capable of not replicating past errors, obviously we're capable of consciously altering our pathway and also of performing a pragmatically useful causal analysis of the cause of our error. Now, if you do psychotherapy with people and they have a traumatic memory, it won't go away. Well, what do you do with it? Well, you go back into the memory and you assess the sequence of events in detail until they have an account that is sufficiently plausible so that they believe that if the same circumstances arose in the future, they would no longer fall prey to that error. So, for example, if it's a naive person who was manipulated badly by a potential romantic partner, then what you do is you say, okay, well, look, what was it about your viewpoint that put you at risk? Now, that isn't blaming the victim. It's helping the victim not be a victim again. It's like, yeah, it was 95% the other person's fault, man. Whatever. They're not in the room with you. All you can do is try not to fall into the same pit. That doesn't mean someone else didn't dig the pit. Okay, so, well, I was too trusting. Okay, well, so let's take that apart. What do you mean too trusting? Well, I always assume the good in people. Well, okay, so, well, what about these instances of people acting in a bad way? Well, I don't really understand that. It's okay, you start to see they need to differentiate up their worldview to take into account the existence of predatory people. And they also generally have to differentiate their view of themselves to stop thinking themselves as nice and harmless. Because it's the nice and harmless naive person that's exploitable by the malevolent psychopath. And that's not moral virtue. That's just weakness. That's all it is. It's naivety. It's the maintenance of a childlike viewpoint, a view of the world far past its expiry date. And so you go back and take that apart. You formulate a more differentiated and sophisticated view of the world. The person finds that plausible. Then you have them practice it so they can see that it has applicability in the real world. And then the emotion from the traumatic memory will go away. Because what's happening is the anxiety system is saying, unexplored territory, unexplored territory, unexplored territory. And what that system wants is to know, A, that someone is trying to map that territory instead of just avoiding the problem, and B, that there is a plan. Now, it's not cognitively sophisticated enough in some way to know if the plan works. It wants to know that someone's in charge and that it's being taken care of. Well, so that's what you do in psychotherapy. You say, look, you can face this. Even though you think you can't, you can. We'll break it into pieces. I'll discuss with you a plethora of potential solutions. We can do it slowly. You can bite off as much as you can chew and no more. And we're going to come up with something that isn't a rationalization for your behavior, a post hoc rationalization. It's a set of new tools so that you do not, when you see that hole in the road, you walk around it. First of all, you'll see it. Second, you'll walk around it. And people are massively encouraged by that process. They're not made less afraid. In fact, they might be made more afraid, but the fear is much more focused, and they know they know how to deal with it. It's like, I didn't think there were dangerous people in the world. Well, there are. Oh my God, the world's much more dangerous. It's like, yes, it is. Well, what am I going to do about that? You're going to get smarter and sharper, right? Because that's the cure. It's not, we're going to make the world less dangerous. The world is plenty dangerous, but it turns out that you're a lot more capable than you thought. So in what sense is this corrective mechanism that you're describing, that is epitomized in this case in psychotherapy, in what sense is that only accomplishable within a social context where you have feedback from other agents? Well, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, I would say, to tie this back to our earlier conversation, is that curative process is the action of the logos in dialogue. Okay, that's what it is. That's what it is. Okay, and so I would also say that the degree to which you can manifest the logos is going to be radically associated with your functionality in human hierarchies. Right? It's the primary determinant of that. It's the essence of genuine charisma. So now that can be parasitized upon, like Hitler did that. That can be parasitized upon. But that doesn't, just because a mechanism has value doesn't mean it can't be parasitized. That happens all the time. It happens constantly.
And the mechanism you're referring to here as genuine charisma is a clear ability to be able to effectively navigate a dominance or a hierarchy?
Yes. And the world. But, it's like the dominance hierarchy is sort of the mediator between you and the world. So when you're negotiating the social world, you are simultaneously negotiating the actual world, unless the social world has become so corrupt that it no longer bears any relationship to the real world, in which case, everyone is in serious trouble. Serious trouble.
Yes, I can think of parts of the world where that is the case.
Oh, yes, it happens quite frequently. That's the emergence of the tyrannical and senile king, right? So the society is no longer adapted to the real world. So then if you adapt to the society, well, it's like you're the captain of a sinking ship. It's like, well, you're going to drown along with everyone else. So it's not that great. It's not that useful.
Right. So we were talking about how so someone who exhibits those qualities can be used for good or evil, let's say, but it's someone who exhibits those qualities that
it's the simulacrum of those qualities that's used for evil.
Right.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, and to relate this to whether people are able to gauge proper behavior or meaningful behavior on their own, or is there a necessity for social?
Oh, yes. Well, they can do it to some degree on their own, but that only works until they have a problem they can't solve.
Right. And is that not sort of an opening for self-deception?
Of course it is. And self-deception in all sorts of ways. Self-deception as a consequence of implicit biases, temperamental biases. Your capacity to think, let's say that's your self-reflective logos, is limited by your ability. So it's limited by your motivations and their purity, let's say. It's limited by your knowledge. It's limited by your localization in this particular period of time and place. And so it's insufficient. And you can tell it's insufficient because problems arise in your life that you can't solve. Well, so then what you do is engage very frequently in joint problem solving. And then you might say, well, what makes a person particularly, let's say, powerful, but wrong, influential, able to function well in the social hierarchy? That's easy. They solve problems. That's what they do. It's like, if you come to someone with a problem and they say, well, here's how you deal with that, it's like, you're pretty happy about that, you'll come back and see them again. It doesn't matter what the avenue is. That's what a mechanic does. This doesn't work. Well, I'll fix it. It's like, hey, right on, man. I'm bringing my car back there. So we're pretty good at evaluating whether or not a problem has been addressed because the problem goes away. And so then we're happy about that because we don't want the problem.
But then how do we account for all this, the various flavors of self-deception that we perceive and mystification of our own hidden motivations that we observe in ourselves, so in some cases, but certainly in others, right? When you talk about, not to pick on them unnecessarily, but just because they pop into my mind, the new atheist, you'd mentioned in our previous interview that it seems that a lot of that thinking is motivated to a degree. But they certainly wouldn't recognize it as motivated. They see it as rational. So,
well, it is rational. It's just rationality that's bounded to too great a degree in my estimation. It's and some of the motivations are, they picked a hill to die on. That's one way of looking at it. Like Dawkins' idea of meme is so close to the idea of archetype. In fact, the last time that Harris and Dawkins spoke, they actually made a joke about that. And Dawkins said, well, if I admitted that, everything would just fall apart. And then they both laughed, ha ha ha. And then they went on. It's like, yeah, guys, you got it, but you backed away. And so as soon as you get the idea of meme, it's like, okay, are there functional memes and non-functional memes? And then how functional is a functional meme? And how about if it's super functional? Well, of course, what a meme is just going to rise is like a parasite. It's only a parasite. I don't think so. Why would you make that presumption?
I mean, it certainly seems possible that there are parasitic-like memes.
There are. There's absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Ideologies are parasitical memes.
Right. there are multiple ways we can take this. The battery's running low, so I'm just going to switch that up.
Okay, I'm going to get a glass of water. What time is it?
There are multiple directions that we can take this discussion because it's so relevant to so much of what we experience both on an individual and a societal level. But I think to be timely and respectful of some of the questions that people have posed in their responses, maybe we can relate what we were just discussing to two areas in particular. So one is the degree to which we should take our religious or mythological formulations that are the product of thousands of years of evolution, both biological and cultural, seriously and or literally.
Sure, you would ask that question.
Right, and that ties back to the question, I think, of the white lie that we were discussing earlier, the white lie or the black truth, in the sense of if something is pragmatically true, but literally appears to be untrue. How does one reconcile that if it's serving the ultimate good?
Okay. So let's start with the first one. Okay, so that question pushes me.
And just from my own memory, and the second point that I want to get to is the risk of ideological possession in today's political climate, and what your own research and what we discussed brings to bear on how to avoid what seems to be an increasingly problematic issue at this particular point in Western history.
Okay, so the first one is with regards to the relationship between the metaphorical and the literal, let's say.
Yes, we've had questions, for instance, to concretize it, we've had questions from Orthodox Christians that view you, for instance, as a defender of Christianity because of what they've read online, and then they listen to what you say and they're like, well, okay, so he's on my side, so to speak, but does he really believe in the divinity of Christ? Does he believe in the transformation of bread into flesh and these sorts of things?
Well, of course, that depends on what you mean by believe and what you mean by divinity.
Yes, exactly. So and the third issue, just to go from there, is, and if so or if not, what in Peterson's estimation is the role or importance of ritual and acting out certain religious precepts? Good.
We'll start with that.
Excellent.
So people often ask me, "Do you believe in God?" Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. It's associated with death and rebirth, clearly, because the Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Sometimes it can be such a big part of you that you actually die, right, instead of dying and being reborn. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. The question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well. The hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by transcended death? Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure for the time being, which I think is the simplest thing to assume. I think there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. You could conclude otherwise, but I feel that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit? Just to qualify that.
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist, patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time. Well, is that an answer to the question? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible. I'm going to do a series on the Bible. That's one of the things I want to investigate more thoroughly and formulate my thoughts about more thoroughly, because it is a crucial issue. A friend of mine said, and I wouldn't describe him, he's certainly not the sort of person that you would describe as a classic Catholic. He's an extraordinarily well-educated individual, and he's come back to Christianity with the most vicious of internal battles, and he said to me, he was the same person who made the comments earlier about the dominance hierarchy. And so he's very insightful. He said that it all falls apart unless you believe in the divinity of Christ and in the resurrection of Christ. And he meant that in a very fundamental way. And there's a way in which that's true. But I don't know exactly what it means yet. Like the metaphorical element of that to me is quite clear. The death and rebirth idea, yeah, you see that echoed all over. It's the most recent manifestation of that idea or one of the most recent manifestations, popular manifestations, is in the Harry Potter series, because it's full of deaths and rebirths of the central hero.
Is it not a manifestation of hope for something beyond the finality of which we have become inescapably conscious?
Well, yes, and of course that's the Freudian critique, right? He just thought about it as a wish fulfillment. Although the problem with that theory is, people also generated up the idea of hell, which doesn't, you could say, well, that's a convenient place to put your enemies and still put it in the wish fulfillment framework, but I think that's absurdly cynical. I mean, people who believe in hell are terrified of hell for themselves, and in my estimation, they should be, because I also believe in hell, although what that means, again, is, subject to interpretation. Lots of people live in hell, and lots of people create it.
But beyond the sort of the basic Freudian, snide interpretation, is it not a belief in the identification with something that transcends your limited existence?
Yes, definitely. But it's funny too, because in the more Christian formulations, there's an insistence on the resurrection of the body, which I find extremely interesting. Even the, say, more sophisticated deist types are kind of willing to go along with the idea that there might be something eternal, transcendent about consciousness or about the spirit or the soul, something like that. But they're certainly not willing to go beyond that. But there's this very peculiar emphasis in Christianity on the resurrection of the body, which is a glorification of the body, which is quite interesting. It's not something you want to dismiss so rapidly, because it is a glorification of the body and an indication of the necessity of the body, of that limitation.
Could that not be an instance of what we were describing earlier in terms of a specific instantiation of a general principle?
Yeah, right.
And it's the instantiation itself that makes it real. The body is the most real thing that we experience on an individual.
Right. Well, and it's real in part because it's limited. Right? It has limitations.
So the focus on the mythological representation of the body as resurrected is saying this is more real. This is just as real as you can imagine.
Yes. Well, it's an elevation of the material, interestingly enough, right? Not a denial of the material, an elevation of the material. It's a very interesting idea. And as I said, I want to explore that more because I'm not fully comfortable with my ability to bridge the gap between the metaphorical and the real, although I think that the way that I described it is as close as I can come right now. Magical things happen as the Logos manifests itself. Now that's self-evidently true. When people...
And when you say magical, you mean magical for all intents and purposes in terms of our perception as relatively naive human consciousness, or magical in rabbits out of hats?
Well, certainly the former. And God only knows about the latter. So, that takes us afield into strange areas. Like Jung's observations of synchronous events, for example. Yes. We don't understand the world. Like, I do think the world is more like a musical masterpiece than it is like anything else. And things are oddly connected. Now, I know that sounds new agey and it sounds metaphysical, and I'm saying bluntly this is speculative, right? I'm feeling out beyond the limits of my knowledge. But there are things I'm not willing to dismiss the mysterious, because I've experienced the mysterious in a variety of different ways, and it's very mysterious. Very.
From a cognitive perspective, is that not the most rational position to take in any case? Because we know our cognition is inherently bounded by a whole range of constraints.
Well, we certainly know that we're bounded by ignorance, and that there's far more going on than we know or can know. We do. The problem is that when you start to speculate, it's a projection of your imagination. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that is actually, knowledge advances through projection of imagination. But the problem is you can see yourself reflected back at you, and then it's self-fulfilling. So you can see what you want to see.
That's right. And what you're describing reminds me of both what I've read and through my experience understood in terms of the Buddhist tradition as well as the Islamic Sufi tradition. They use almost identical metaphors as we were just using to describe this experience, in the sense that to experience the mysterious in its most pristine form, you precisely have to rid yourself of yourself to avoid those projections. You want a clean mirror, so to speak, is the symbology that's often used in Islamic mysticism, so that it best reflects what's actually mysterious, and you're not merely projecting your vain imagination.
Well, that would also be akin to the idea that I presented earlier, that you want to speak and live the truth so that you don't muddy your vision, right? Because then you're blind and you will walk into things. That's why you tell the truth. You see, the problem is if you lie, you believe the lies. The problem with not telling the truth is you falsify your map and you will wander off the pathway. How could it possibly be any other way?
And that's also precisely what, according to the scripture, Buddha said. He said, false beliefs are the problem, right? You have to rid yourself of these false beliefs. And if you follow that all the way through, then you will reach that. Then you have the soteriological goal, which may or may not be, an achievable reality.
Right. It's an ever receding horizon.
That's right, but it's nonetheless, that's what we're aiming for.
Yeah, well, and it seems like the right aim. It seems like the right aim.
And in Islamic Sufi mysticism, regardless, you can speculate as to the etiology of Islamic Sufi mysticism and its relationship to other forms of mysticism that predate Islam. the goal is precisely the same. It's literally the metaphors that are used are polishing the mirror, so that you best reflect what is divine, and in this sense, divine in terms of the logos, the ultimate truth, and you're not muddying it with your own
lies.
Precisely, or purely inaccuracies, or so that there seems to be something fundamental that
well, the fundamental issue is that you should get your map right. I mean, the problem is that even if you try, it isn't clear how good a map you can make. But that's okay, because try as hard as you can, you'll find out. But it's certainly the case, and maybe it'll be a good enough map. Maybe it'll be an accurate map. You don't know. Independent of your inevitable ignorance, you can certainly stop being willfully ignorant and see what happens. And my sense, too, is that you don't get to complain about the structure of the world until you stop falsifying your relationship with it, because you don't know to what degree the pathology of your being is associated with the falsification.
Because it's inherently bound up with your subjective experience, or if we can even subtract subjective. It's essentially bound up with one's experience.
Right. And it's essentially because what you're doing is you're twisting and bending your value structure, and that's what determines the focus of your perception and your emotional responses, all of that. So get your aim right. Well, what's the aim? Truth. And I think it has to be nested in love. And love is the notion that, it's something like the notion that despite its suffering, being is good, and you should serve being. And that's a decision you have to make, because you can easily say, well, being is corrupt and evil, and there's plenty of evidence for that. So it's a decision. And so being is good. I'm going to serve good being, and to do so means to tell the truth. Well, then and then you play that out. And then the magic happens, and that I believe to be the case. I think I do believe in some sense that's self-evident.
What you just described to me. So you're most familiar with the Christian theological tradition. I'm more familiar with Islamic Sufi and Buddhist theological tradition. What you just described is incredible, from my understanding of Sufism and other mystical traditions, in the sense that the twin principles that motivate the polishing of one's mirror, so to speak, are the principle of truth, ultimate truth, which is synonymous in the Arabic and Persian languages with God. It's one and the same. Haq. And love. Love, and not love in the sense of I love my puppy, but love in an all-consuming sense, one that motivates your entire being.
Right. Well, and the way that I interpret that, and I try to do this in my therapeutic practice, I try to do this all the time, is I want the best for what wants the best in you. It's like that part, I'm that part's friend. And when my clients come in, it's like, and this is different than the unconditional positive regard that the Rogerians talked about, which I think was an oversimplification. It's like, I don't have unconditional positive regard. I am not on the side of you that's aiming at your defeat. I'm not at all on that side. I'm on the side of you that's struggling towards the light, right? And I'm on the side of that part of me. At least I'm trying to be on the side of that. And that's the definition of love, I believe, because what it means is I truly want I truly want the best for what wants the best in you. Yeah.
Okay.
And people love that. They love that, man. If you're interacting with people with that ethos in mind, they find that, well, I think that's partly why people are responding so positively to my videos, because that ethos informs the videos. I'm saying I'm trying to figure out what's the best for us, really, like the best, not the best for me, although that's part of it, because here I am, and I'm in the game too. But I'm so greedy, let's say. I don't just want the best for me. That's not enough for me. I'm too greedy for that. Maybe I'm too selfish for that. I want the best for me in a way that's the best for everyone else too, because that's even better. And I think, well, that's another interesting thing about being bounded by death, is that you have nothing to lose. You might as well aim for the highest goal, because what have you got to lose that you aren't already going to lose? Nothing. And you have everything, hypothetically, to gain. So
what, on the last point then, to direct us to the second question, I think it flows quite nicely, is what motivates people to cling to their particular ideological map of reality in spite of what you just described. And it seems like, to me and to other observers, this could be a question of confirmation, an issue of confirmation bias, but it seems like, as you've said, that we're at a sort of turning point in Western, I would say global civilization at this point.
I think so.
The Western-Eastern distinction, I don't think, is any longer that helpful. Where people seem to be reacting to what they're experiencing with an unusual degree of ideological fervor.
Yep.
Yet again, it's only been about 60 years, 60, 70 years since we saw a major conflagration premised on that issue.
You bet.
Right? How do we avoid this? How do we learn from that, based on your understanding and your in-depth study of this? What's the solution there?
Well, I think the solution is an individual one, because the other solutions are collective, and the collective solutions are, in some sense, the problem. Now, why do people become ideologically possessed? Okay, well, some of it's just confirmation bias, like temperamental bias. Then you can add ignorance to that. Then you could add willful blindness to that. And with the ignorance issue, you can more specifically diagnose historical ignorance. That's why I recommend that people read the Gulag Archipelago, for example. There's things that we need to know in order to set ourselves right. And the people that I've found that have been most useful in that regard have been Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Carl Jung and a smattering of others. But I think they had their finger on the pulse, fundamentally. And it's not like they're the only people. I'm not claiming that at all. But there's deeper issues too. And one of the deeper issues is, well, what do you do with the responsibility? Well, if you're an ideologue, then the bad people are those who don't think like you. That's really convenient. It's like, not only do you not have to do anything about it because you're already on the side of the good, so it's alleviated you of any moral responsibility, but yet you can still act as if you're the exemplar of morality itself. Plus, you have a target now for all the unexamined vengefulness and hatred and corruption in your own heart. And so that's a tempting plethora of temptations, right? It's easy, it's quick, it's handed to you. It means that you don't have to adopt any responsibility. It means you can camouflage yourself as a moral agent. It means that you have a target for your hatred, and it's a justifiable target. But I think of all of those issues, the avoidance of responsibility is the cardinal issue. It's the most important issue. It sort of fights with the that's it. It's the most important issue. This is what I see at the universities, is that the students are taught to go out and protest. There's the people who are messing up the planet. Go tell them that they're bad. You don't offer a solution, even. You just tell them that they're bad. It's like, that's the pathway to achievement. It's not.
Well, one can do both. And we see evidence of that in very recent Western political history, right? The civil rights movement.
I think that you can't do the latter till you earn the right to. You can't, because I don't believe that you.
In what sense is it a case that people on both sides? I hate to bifurcate it this way, but it's perceived this way. Two sides of the divide, the left and the right. Right. In what sense is it that people are mistaking the form for the content? In that they may be looking back in history and looking up to movements that involved either it's speaking truth to power, which I think is part of what motivates a lot of the right and even the so-called alt-right. Just saying things that they should be able to say, regardless of whether it serves the higher moral truth or not, and the inclination to protest and speak truth to the power of the dominance hierarchy, the power structure, I think, is often what motivates much of what's on the left. To what degree do you think the conflagration the coming to a head that we're experiencing is when people mistake the form of that expression, the form of that protest, for the importance of the content in the sense of the purity.
Yeah,
of the
fine. That's a perfectly reasonable. That's again why I would say that it heads back towards the individual.
Okay, so how do we collectively solve that individual problem, or is that not solvable?
I think that we collectively solve the individual problem by noting that the collective is subordinate to the individual, which is really the Western claim. It's the fundamental Western claim, is that what's at the pinnacle of the collective is the piece of the pyramid that detaches itself. That's the I, right? It's the individual logos fundamentally that the collective has to serve, because the logos is the thing that rejuvenates the collective.
So is there a conflation there between the individual, as in the individual human being, versus, or as well as that which is able to speak truth as precisely and clearly as possible? In your mind, are those two melded, or
well, that would be the ideal, that they're melded. The individual is the truth-bearing vessel, not the collective. The collective is the dead remnants of the past. Now you need it. It's a container. It's necessary, but it's always out of date. Always. It's always out of date and at least semi-tyrannical. Partly because it's out of date. Partly because it's partly corrupt. But it's the soul of the individual, the spirit of the individual. We could say motivated by love, attempting to manifest itself in truth. That's the cure for that malaise. And that's an ancient idea. It's the most ancient idea. It's the most ancient written idea we have. You see it in the Enuma Elish, the Mesopotamian creation myth. That's Marduk.
So could one, again, from a devil's advocate perspective, not argue that what's motivating some of the things that have concerned you with respect to the left is advocating precisely for that, the rights of individuals who have thus far been maligned in our society, or not given the proper space because of stigma?
Well, I do think that to the degree that the left is motivated by the desire, by love and the desire for truth, that the left does serve that. I mean, I think the left has been very effective in many ways in holding the concerns of the less fortunate in up so that others can see it. I believe that that's a valid role the left can play. I believe that they have abandoned that role because they're serving a particular ideology. I believe that that's why Hillary Clinton lost the last election. They abandoned the working class. That's a bad idea, because the working class needs a voice, and the working class is in rough shape. And there's a variety of reasons for that are complex. The working class needs a voice. The oppressed need a voice. But that doesn't mean they need a genuine voice. They need a genuine voice. And I think that genuine voice is lacking. I think the left has been hijacked by people who are neither motivated by love nor by truth.
So to concretize this then, in terms of people's, at least here in Vancouver, for instance, instinctive reaction to protect otherwise marginalized individuals, such as transgender people.
Yes, we are definitely not talking about instinctive reactions. The instinctive reaction is nothing but an impulse. It is not a moral virtue.
Right.
That's just maternal instinct. And maternal instinct is just as dangerous as it is benevolent. I mean, that was, I suppose, Freud's major contribution. But, the Oedipal mother is the devouring mother. That's the witch who lives inside the castle or the gingerbread house. She's just too damn good to be true. The problem with over-mothering creatures is that they stay infantile. So the fact that you feel sorry for someone and want to help them is just the bare beginning of what you need to do to actually do something that's useful. And to confuse that with solving the problem is well, I'm caring. Well, yeah, who cares if you're caring? Like, fine, what? A sparrow is caring. That's not the issue. That's the issue that's not the issue.
So, again, to concretize this, because I think this exercise is extremely useful, based on what we started the conversation with, to take this from the more general to the specific, in terms of, let's say, protecting transgender people who have been really maligned in society. There's an incredibly high suicide rate amongst transgenders, right? They have difficulty finding work. They have difficulty maintaining normal relationships. Well,
of course they have difficulty maintaining normal relationships. They're not going to maintain a normal relationship. That's not possible. They're in an abnormal situation. So now that doesn't mean they don't get to have relationships, but it certainly means that they're not going to be normal. And, there's a price to be paid for being different. Now, you could say, well, that price should be minimized to the degree that that's possible.
Right.
Fair enough.
That is the argument, I believe.
Fair enough.
That is the articulated argument of people on the left,
yeah.
amongst those in the radical left that you say are motivated by more nefarious.
Yeah, I don't believe it. I don't believe that. In fact, I don't think the transgender people believe it. Because I've got letters from about 35 transgender people now. Every single one of them, except one, said they agreed with me. They do not regard these activists as their legitimate representatives. They are not happy with the fact that this pronoun issue has made them more salient to the community. They don't trust the people who purport to represent them. So, representation requires legitimacy. And just because you're an activist who says that you care for people, or even if you happen to be a member of the community, which, by the way, is not a community in any sense of the word, it's a range of people that are just as diverse as any other range of people, none of that gives you legitimacy as a representative. And this brings us right back to the beginning. I do not believe that legislation like Bill C-16 is in the least in the interest of these people who are marginalized. Quite the contrary. I believe they're sacrificial victims to the onslaught of a continuing postmodern neo-Marxist ideology.
Right, and I think many people just they don't see what you say you see. They don't see the historical context in which you are observing the phenomenon. So, how, as a message to people who are watching this and trying to work their way through, a lot of young people who are trying to navigate this increasingly perilous minefield of divisive politics in today's day and age, how do they know, what are the heuristics they use? What are the signposts they use to understand, am I on the right path? Is what I'm being taught or is what I'm being attracted to politically motivated from a sense of what's actually best for the community that I'm nominally caring for?
Well, that requires, you might say, well, that requires careful meditation and prayer. If you wanted to be traditional about it, I would say you have to determine, this is a process of soul searching. What are you oriented towards? And the answer could easily be nothing. Well, this is why I produced the Future Authoring Program. You got to be oriented towards something, because otherwise you're disoriented. You just spin around in circles and then you suffer. And so do people around you. It's not a good solution. Orient yourself towards something. You have to figure out what it is. What will work for you? What goal would justify the suffering of your life? Start trying to piece that together. You're going to get better at it. But it's a personal process. And you should use your education to inform that. So you need a personal place to stand, because otherwise you're going to be handed a place to stand on a plate. And it may be one that makes you a puppet of someone else's goals. So I would say, what are the processes? Well, I think what I've recommended to people is clean up your room. That's a good start. Organize your local landscape. Schedule your time. Start taking control of yourself. See if you can stop saying things you know to be lies. That's not the same as telling the truth. You don't get to do that to begin with because you're not good enough at it to even attempt it in some sense. But everyone can stop saying things they know to be falsehoods. They can use their own damn definition of falsehood.
Right, but in your definition, importantly, I think, in your definition, falsehood includes the higher level moral truth.
Yes, it's living wrong.
You can say something that is literally true, but of course, like you said earlier, it's a black truth in the sense that at a moral level, you're saying something to cause a social effect that is actually negative. I would
say, stop saying things that violate your conscience instead of stop saying things you know to be untrue, because we run into the truth problem. But I would say, stop. Here's another idea. Stop saying and doing things that make you feel weak. Just all you have to do is pay attention to that. Some things you do will make you feel disintegrated. It's a physiological sensation. Disintegrated and weak. It's something that Carl Rogers commented on. He thought about that as part of, now I can't remember the word. It's something like integrity. But that isn't the word he used. But some things improve your integrity and some things disintegrate you. Now, the things that disintegrate you, you often do to impress other people, or because you're taking a shortcut, or you're escaping what you know to be your moral obligation. And your moral obligation stems naturally from your aims. Like once you have aims, you have moral obligations. They come together because the moral obligation is what you need to do in order to obtain the aim. So, and if you don't have an aim, well, then you're aimless. So that's not a solution. So along with the aims come the moral obligations. Then when you violate the moral obligations, you'll have a sense of that violation. It's like, well, you have to stop doing that. Or that's something you could do. You don't have to. You don't have to do any of this. But I would say that's where people should start. You start small. It's not small. You think it's small. It's not small. I had a girl come up to me last night at the end of my talk, and this happens all the time. She said, I started cleaning up my room last year, and it completely changed my life. She said, your room is an externalization of your mind. And that's right. That's exactly true. To the degree that you're in your room, the room is you. Now, that isn't how people think, but that's okay. It doesn't matter if they think that way. That's how it is. So straighten up what you can straighten up and quit saying things that make you feel weak. And then you'll know what to do next.
It's one last point on this that, because we're running short on time, but I would like to touch on this. So one point that concerns me is what you're saying, because I find so much of what you've shared with the world at this point, using the technological means we have available, to be of immense value. The way you articulate what many of us feel to be true, but aren't able to put into logos.
Well, that's another hallmark of truth, is that it snaps things together. And people write to me all the time and say that. It's as if things were coming together in my mind. It's like, well, that's what archetypes do. Right. Archetypes glue things together. So yes, it's the proper expression of unconscious being teaches people what they already know. It's kind of like the Platonic idea that all learning was remembering. It's right. It's not right exactly the way that we would think of learning and remembering now, but you have a nature, and when you feel that nature articulated, it's
like the act of snapping the puzzle pieces together. Yes. They're right there.
Yes, well, that's the bringing the levels of being into synchrony. That's what you feel. It's like, oh, that's synchronized now. It's like what I think and the way I feel have come together. And you feel that snap. It's like, oh, it's a simpler state. It's something like that. It's not rife with contradictions anymore. Yeah.
So just to follow through on this thought then, so what concerns me to a degree is, and maybe it shouldn't concern me, but I'll express this anyway, there's such value in what you've been sharing for the reasons we just discussed just a second ago. But because of the context in which this arose recently, some of your ideas have been taken up by people on the right who may suffer from exactly the same kinds of ideological possession issues that you argue some people on the extreme left suffer from. And the degree to which what you have been arguing or putting forth or sharing with people becomes conflated with the ideologically possessed arguments on the right or the alt-right is deeply concerning for someone who thinks that, who feels and knows that what you have to say is so incredibly valuable, because they'll just.
I've had many people write me from the right or from the fringes of the radical right saying precisely that listening to my lectures stopped them from going all the way. So I would say that if people listen to what I'm saying, then that isn't going to happen. Now, has my message been co-opted? I would say to a much lesser degree than people think. All you have to do is go read the YouTube comments. And there's thousands and thousands of them. And I mean, YouTube comments, it's like most of them are, generated by denizens from the pits of hell. They're really dismissive, aggressive, rude, vulgar, thoughtless, provocative, prejudicial. I mean, you name it, man.
We were discussing before off camera the notion of, I think it's called Godwin's Law,
right,
where at a certain point, a YouTube or any internet discussion will degenerate into Nazi comparisons.
Right, exactly. And so, but that isn't what characterizes the comment stream on my YouTube videos, with very rare exceptions. And so I don't believe that what I've been discussing has been co-opted to any significant degree. I think that what has happened is that at this time and place, for some reason, it isn't the people on the left who are particularly open to the message, but that's because I think that they're far more gripped by the totalitarian spirit than people aligned along the rest of the spectrum. And they also have more power. Now, they have more institutional power of a certain type, particularly in the universities.
I was going to say this sounds like a highly academic context in which you're describing, yes, and I identify. I've experienced what you're identifying, so I can relate to that. But in terms of what concerns me is looking at the wider societal and global context. There is definitely a resurgence of the right, and as someone whose family, for instance, suffered under the Nazi regime, it's disturbing. And
well, it's the polarization, eh? The polarization is disturbing. And, what I try to recommend to people, and I did in my talk last night, for example, is that they find someone that they don't agree with and have a conversation with them. Now, it has to be someone that you can have a conversation with, but a lot of that will just involve listening. It's like we have to extend our hands across the gap, because otherwise we'll polarize. That's what's happening. You saw it in Berkeley last week. And that's, that could be just the beginning. And there's lots of people who would like that. That's not a good idea. It's a very bad idea. And I would say it's still my estimation that at the moment, it's the radicals on the left that are primarily responsible for this. And they're primarily responsible particularly because of their stance on free speech. Like, I can't go to Linfield College now. And some arbitrary administrator used a specious excuse to say, no, well, he can't come, even though I was invited. I was already invited. I'd already paid for the airfare. It's like they feel that there is a large coterie of people who feel that it's in their bailiwick to determine who can speak. And that's a very bad idea. And
so to clarify for people, because I think the way you're describing this inherently speaks to people at the moment, and again, I hesitate to buy into this bifurcation, but people who identify at the moment with the right.
Yeah, well, put it this way. The campuses have not been infiltrated by right-wing radicals. Not at all. Right. Not in the least.
The campuses.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that is that's where the campuses, the humanities, let's lay it out again. Theology at the bottom, philosophy after that. Well, that's where the humanities are. The humanities are nearest to the foundation of our culture. And they're completely dominated by radical leftists, postmodern neo-Marxists. It's not, and that's not my opinion. That's well documented. Right. There aren't even conservatives in those domains, let alone right-wingers. There's not even any conservatives. I mean, maybe you can call conservatives right-wing. I think you're pushing your luck when you do that. But there's no conservatives even. So the centrists are on the right as far as the people in the humanities are concerned. Well, that's not good. And it's seriously not good, because the humanities have way more effect on our culture than we think. So way more.
In what sense do you think the rise, and in some sense or frightening resurgence of popularity in right-wing and even extreme right-wing political movements, as opposed to what's on campus, is a semi-conscious reaction to the possession of, as you were saying, the inherent ideological foundations of our society being...
I think it's exactly that. I mean, it's more than that, because, things get amalgamated. It's always useful for people to find someone to hate and hit. And so that motivation drives radicals on both sides of the political spectrum, right? And obviously you can see that because it's starting to happen. So, but it's certainly the case that, look, if the Democrats wouldn't have played identity politics, Hillary would have won the election. It's as simple as that. So, and people also should note that it wasn't just the federal presidency that the Democrats lost. They lost everything, right? At the state level too. It's like they're pushing people too hard. And they have their ideological reasons for it, and I don't find them credible. And it's the grounding in postmodernism and the secret grounding underneath that in neo-Marxism. And people are not going to put up with that, and they shouldn't. So
I think we have to wrap up because you have a remaining schedule here in Vancouver. But would you be willing to say, for the record and to the camera, and if you're not, that's fine, but would you be willing to say that you yourself actually do not identify with the what appear to be, for some of us, more insidious elements of the right?
I'm not political. I've made my decision many times. I've thought of running for political office. And if I did in Canada, the most logical place for me to be would be in the Liberal Party, although I think that it's also been hijacked by the social justice warrior types to a very damaging degree, especially you see that in Ontario. But I've decided at multiple points in my life that I'm not playing at the political level. I'm playing at the philosophical level, or maybe I'm playing at the theological level. And what I'm trying to do is to say what I think as clearly as I possibly can, and to listen to the feedback and modify my message when that seems to be necessary. And apart from that, I'm willing to let the chips fall where they will, because that's also part of the decision. The decision is that if you believe, if you choose to believe, if you choose to act as if the truth brings being into existence in the best possible manner, then you speak your truth, you examine your conscience, you listen to feedback, and you allow the events to unfold as they will. And I am trying to do that. That's what I'm attempting to do.
So on the very final question then, on that point, you've mentioned how what's most important to you is having the space, both individually and as a society, to think through the things that you are trying to make sense of in public or with others, to be able to freely articulate what you're
to jointly articulate it.
Right.
Yes,
and we don't know how to do it right at the beginning, right? We
definitely
we
not.
Need that space to make mistakes.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
Is there
and even to make them publicly.
That's right. Is there anything personally now, looking back, that maybe you haven't said thus far? Maybe you have, or maybe something you haven't. That, knowing what you know now, having gone through what's happened over the last year or so, is there anything that you would reformulate? Is there any correction or corrective measure that you would take to more clearly articulate things that you articulated back when this?
Well, I would say that I'm trying to do that on an ongoing basis. I mean, right from the beginning, after the first video went roughly viral, I have a group of friends who span the political spectrum who stood by me, let's say, as well as my family, and I'm talking to them constantly about what I'm doing wrong, and mostly what I'm doing wrong. When I'm angry, when I'm because maybe I have learned to some degree how to harness part of the energy of anger as a source of energy. Now that has its advantages and disadvantages. Its advantage is a certain kind of forcefulness. It's also a good suppressor of a good competitor for fear, because anger suppresses fear. The feedback I've received is that the more reasonable I am, the better, and that of course makes sense. And then there's been a plethora of small and specific criticisms. And I've tried to attend to them. I've tried to attend to them as carefully as I can. I mean, I've been in a situation especially for the first 4 months, where had I said one thing that was self-evidently non-credible, that would have justified a claim of bigotry or racism or any of those things, I would have been sunk. And so I wouldn't say I'm pleased with my performance, because it isn't a performance and it isn't something to be pleased about or displeased about. But I can say that to the degree that it's possible, I've done my best to do what I said I'm doing, which is to say what I think as clearly as I can. That's all I'm trying to do. When I go in front of people, I'm not trying to convince them of anything. I'm really not. It's up to them to do. I don't want to convince people of something. They're responsible for their own suffering. I don't want to manipulate their destinies. I don't believe that I know enough about the particularities of their life to dare to do that. What I do when I speak to people is try to formulate my thoughts on that particular topic more clearly. That's my lecture style. I'm thinking. I'm not delivering a prepackaged talk. I mean, now and then I'll write it, but that's only when I'm developing a really new idea and I haven't And it has to be a structured argument. And I've only done that like in 3 of my YouTube videos. It's very rare. Most of the time I have a skeleton. There's the argument. There's the skeletal outline. I see how I'm going to get from point A to B to C. And then when I'm talking, like today, it's an exploration. It's not, here's what I think, it's right, and you should believe it. It's like, no, I'm trying to rectify my errors and extend what I know when I'm speaking and when I'm listening. And so I think that genuinely is what I'm doing. And I genuinely don't want to give people advice. It's something I've learned not least by being a psychotherapist. It's like, your destiny is not mine to mess with. I don't want to be responsible for your decisions. What if I'm wrong?
Nonetheless, as you said, you do have the impulse to want the best.
Well, yes, but
with what an individual.
Yes, we could have a discussion, a productive discussion about what might be the best for you. You know, and I do that with my clients all the time. It's like they come and see me and they've got problems, and I say, okay, well, if we could come up with a solution, what would that solution look like? You know, let's lay the cards on the table. We can explore a bunch of different solutions. But I'm really trying, and this is partly the influence of Carl Rogers, you know, is I'm really trying to help the person find their own way, because that's not going to be my way. It's going to be their way. And if they find their way, that will be best for them, and it will be best for the people around them. And so it'll be best for me, for that matter. So it's in my interest, in my selfish self-interest, to help the other person find his or her way, and not my way, except insofar as my way is trying to explore and generate more accurate representations of the world.
Right. So is there a concrete example to just end on this note of concretization that we discussed and the importance of bringing it to a cognitive level that is familiar and embodied for us? Is there a concrete example of something where you said something, and I'm not thinking of anything in particular, I'm being entirely genuine here. Is there an instance where you feel you said something that appeared to be true to you at the time, and knowing what you know? Yes,
I think I was a little dismissive of the men going their own way, because I think I called them pathetic weasels, and I had my reasons for that. My reasons were, roughly speaking, that
who are the men going their own way? Just for context.
Well, they're a group of people, mostly on the net, who've been burned in their relationships, or who conceptualize themselves as having been burned in their relationships. And they believe that the legal structure in particular in Western countries is so tilted against men, particularly in family dispute situations and divorce settlement, that it's safer for men not to establish permanent relationships with women, not to cohabit with them, ever. And they're a large movement. Now, how large they are, I don't know, but they're large enough. And they have what I would regard as an undue influence over relatively bitter and resentful young men who haven't had great success in the dating market and who are looking for a rationale to write off all women because they're so hurt by their continual rejection. And that is not good for those young men. And so the reason that I disparaged the men going their own way was because I had seen the pernicious effect, these are often older guys, the pernicious effect of their world-weary philosophy on young men. Now, these guys think that they're just warning them, and they are warning them, but they're not just warning them. Now, the reason I regret calling them pathetic weasels is because they also have a point. I do believe that the court systems are staggeringly anti-male, absurdly, horribly anti-male. And I've seen my own clients, some of them who are really, really decent, hardworking, family-oriented people, demolished by the court systems. And so the men going their own way have a point. And so I'm sorry that I called them pathetic weasels. But I outlined my reasons. And so, yes, I do regret that. I have to be careful because I do have a dark satirical sense of humor. And I can utter epithets, let's say, for the sake of punctuating a point, while simultaneously forgetting that 150,000 people will listen to it. So I regret that. Other than that, I'm judging my behavior on the degree to which my trajectory is upward. And I believe that I have responsibly improved the articulation of my arguments with every iteration of them. And I think that had that not been happening, I would have been taught a very serious lesson, because there were plenty of people, and still are, who would be perfectly happy to see me be taught a very serious lesson. It's quite terrifying. You know, I'm on a tightrope. It's not as much a tightrope as it was, but for a long time, for months, had I said anything erroneous or insufficiently careful, I would have been in trouble. And had anybody dug up anything that I said in the past, which is also, and that's worked in my favor, because of course when I made these public pronouncements, there was already 500 hours of videos online. And so had I been a reprehensible individual, you know, unless I was capable of deceit at levels that far exceed the average, there would have been some line somewhere in one of the videos that I made when I was having an off day where I said something that could be taken out of context and you know, paint me and smear me with it. But that hasn't happened. And I think the reason that hasn't happened is because, touch wood, those utterances actually don't exist. So
that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much.
Right.
We've gone way over time, but I think it was worth it.
Thank you for listening to the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. To support these podcasts, you can donate to Dr. Peterson's Patreon account, the link to which can be found in the description of this episode.